Okay, so our last speaker before afternoon tea, so no pressure, Amelia, but this better be good. Now, try and cut Amelia a bit of slack. She's been very kind coming in, even though she's on her almost deathbed. So Amelia Veale from Narrative Marketing is here to talk to us about podcasting. Who listens to podcasts every week? All right, so we probably don't need to even, let's just not do this. Yeah? So Amelia is the Chief Storyteller and Director of Narrative Marketing. Her career in marketing spans nearly 2 decades and includes working for local and state government, the non-profit sector, plus a range of small to medium businesses. So you may have seen Amelia around the last couple of years, just talking about talking to people and getting some podcasts coming together. So she's here today to share her tips with everyone. So we'll make all the technology work for you and then we'll be good.
Okay. And now which one? So this one's mine. This one. Okay. So, hello everybody. It's like getting close to 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So you're all super awake, right? I get it. I apologise. You can hear, well, you might not know, but my voice is not quite so croaky normally. So I've got my lemon and sage drink and I've been resting my vocal cords. I don't know what that was, but that was excited too. I've been resting my vocal cords, so I hope I can get through this full session with you. Losing my voice, I'm a podcaster. Wow, what a pain. Anyway, so I am going to be talking about one of my favourite topics, which is podcasting. I'll see if I can figure out how this works. Ooh, cool. Got it right. But about me, my business is called Narrative Marketing. I love storytelling. And I'm also like really obvious and put it on T-shirts and stuff like that. It also really takes out the pressure of deciding what to wear. So this is new today, everyone. This is the first time you're all seeing this. This is the blue version. I have a white and a black version. I have a long sleeve version. They're all the same, but I changed the colour. Wow. I'm wild. I am really wild. I have 2 kids, and this is my version of fun. Okay. And that's me. I tell stories. People say sometimes, what do you do? I tell stories. And they go, oh, right, you work at kindergarten. Not quite. But anyway, sometimes I feel like it depends on the clients. I didn't say that. Chris Warman is here behind the scenes. He loves this when I do this because he's behind the scenes. That's where he likes it. But I like pointing him out. See over there, everyone wave at Chris. Hi, Chris. So we do a lot of video content as well as podcasts. And back in 2016, when I started my podcast, Be The Drop, I said to Chris, who's a videographer, oh, mate, there's audio in video, so can you just edit the podcast as well? Like, that'll be fine, right? It's like when people tell graphic designers how to design. Oh, they love it. Anyway, we're coming up to nearly 4 years, so I think this week is episode 150 of Be The Drop, my podcast, and so he can edit audio, right? I knew that. So anyway, that's a little bit about us, but podcasts. Now, there was a really great show of hands, so most of you know what podcasts are, but I am going to go through and give a little bit of stats and a little bit of explanation because I'm like one of those people that hate it when somebody assumes that I know what they're talking about. So I didn't want to do that today. And the definition is from John Lee Dumas, this definition of podcasts, who has a podcast called Entrepreneurs on Fire, for those of you who are not familiar, and it says stuff like, and there's Americans in the room, so you'll love my version of American accent. It's like, hello, 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 Fire Nation. He does stuff like that. I've met John on a couple of occasions. He's a really nice guy. It's a recorded audio file available on podcast directories to consume in an on-demand manner. Now, for me, the reason I really like this definition is it's consumed on an on-demand manner. Now, that is one of the key points we're talking today. Well, my presentation is about why podcasts and the time is now. is because more and more people want to be able to consume content when they want, where they want, and how they want. And podcasts do this incredibly well. I can be driving and listening to a podcast. If I've got my Google Home set up, as soon as I pull up and then I walk in at home, it continues that podcast at the same spot. Like, you know, I can set up my life so that I can engage to whatever, for whenever, as how long as I want. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I watched free-to-air TV because Netflix is my on-demand version. As I mentioned before, I've got 2 kids, so my time slots when I want to consume content suits me, and podcasts do that. Where to listen to podcasts. Now, this is like just a very small selection of those podcast directories. So I said podcast directories because basically your podcast lives in one location and then it has to get pushed out to all these different directories, which is where people listen to it. The number one being Apple Podcasts, which was previously iTunes, but they transitioned Apple Podcasts on the mobile devices some time ago and more recently onto your computers as well, so desktop too. Google got involved, I think it was early last year, 2018, and created their own podcast app, and they've got involved on a desktop way as well. I'll show you that in a minute. And Spotify. So Apple Podcasts has pretty much owned the space for a very long time, but there's more and more data coming out where Spotify is taking over the podcast space, not in Australia or in America, but in South America, I think, in the Netherlands and a few other countries, Spotify has overtaken Apple Podcasts. And Spotify have been really aggressively doing that. They've been buying all sorts of the distribution chains for podcasts, so podcast platforms and podcast creations, spaces. Spotify have been spending, and they've got a really aggressive plan on that. These are some of the other podcast apps. Pocket Casts is a great one. It was developed here in Adelaide and sold last year to a conglomerate of big American podcast content creators because they're trying to protect the open source nature of podcasts, which I'll explain a bit later. So this is where you can listen. I mentioned Google. Google obviously owns the internet. I mean, you can disagree with me if you want. But they kind of do. And now Google, over the last couple of years has gotten involved with podcasts. They're including them in their algorithm. How they're including them in their algorithm changes all the time, and who knows, because that's Google and their algorithms. But at the moment, what's really cool is someone can be searching for my podcast, come up with results, and hit play directly from that search. This is both on mobile and desktop. So you can play podcasts now directly from Google. So, and this is great. So SEO, I'm not an SEO expert. I can talk a little bit about on-page SEO, but realistically, that's not my skill set. However, having audio content, like video content, helps improve your SEO. It's improving the footprint of your business messages, so enabling more people to find you. So, which is really cool. There's so many exciting things happening in this audio space. Number of people listening, like 20% of Australians listened in the last week, except for in this room, because I think it was more like 80. It was a good show of hands, so you guys are high achievers. Well done. More than half have tried listening, and we're seeing increasing demographics in our younger generation of listeners. And it sort of tapers out around 60, which is probably not all surprising. It's kind of a technology type thing. The higher percentage female listener numbers, there are differences depending on categories on this. This data came from an ABC survey network, and I believe ABC's audience is probably slightly skewed towards female as well. In true crime, the females do listen a lot, but then there's a lot of other podcasts, like I was just talking about the Joe Rogan show before. It's a huge one. It's not for me, but the listeners are more male for that as well anyway. So it really does become a bit genre specific. So it's probably closer to 50-50 podcasts and increasing in time. So in Australia, basically all the data keeps going up in Australia and internationally. So people are spending more time listening to more podcasts and more people are listening. And this is the same internationally. Internationally, the numbers are higher with 26% of Americans and 23% in the UK. But all of them are on the go. And so is podcast ad revenue. Honestly, every time I look at this data, it keeps increasing. So the numbers here are probably out of date as of today. I mean, podcasting is evolving at a rapid rate. Apple have just released new categories. So, in other slides, I've had categories listed for podcasts, but they changed. So my podcast itself now is in an obsolete category. That's how quickly it changes. But the one thing that has stayed steadily the same is that the numbers are increasing, which is exciting. Now, this is a little interactive bit, but it's not as fun because all of you put your hands up. I mean, well done you for being high achievers. Anyway, I'm going to do it anyway. But basically, this is how I think, or do you have to do something? I just keep pressing this and hoping for a different response. This is how to find a podcast, because literally I do get people who say, I don't know where to find a podcast. So if you're on an Android, type in here, Be the Drop. Oh no, we've missed it. Oh, hang on. I'm doing wrong things. Anyway, okay. We're finding Be the Drop and we're subscribing. I jumped to the punchline, which is super sad, but anyway. So this is how you find a podcast on an Android device. You've gone into your app, we've used Google Podcasts here, and we've searched for Be the Drop, and we've subscribed. Here we are on Apple, search, type in Be the Drop. Is everyone doing this? Are you playing along? And then I hope so, because then I'm going to leave here and check my numbers, and so everyone's gone into Be the Drop, practiced, and hit subscribe, right? The gag didn't work as well because we missed the first one. Apologies. But anyway, I'm putting that down to being sick. This is how you find a podcast. The only thing I'd add to that, if you're on an Android device, you don't necessarily have a native app on your phone. You might have to download one. And in this example, we had downloaded the Google Podcast app. But as I showed you the previous slide, there's lots of different apps, and it really depends. Number of them you have to pay a certain amount, so just pick based on that. But Google Podcasts is free. And Apple comes with its own, all iPhone devices come with their own Apple Podcast. Okay, so observations just generally are setting the scene on podcasts, because I'm going to move on to what that means for us as marketers. Podcast continues to grow. Is this like a naughty place to say this? Social media usage is decreasing, led by decline in Facebook. Not all, obviously, but the numbers, Twitter's had down numbers, even Snapchat. So there has been a shift away, and I was reading an article recently that it's also the amount of time that people are spending on social media is decreasing. Whereas things like watching videos on YouTube, listening to podcasts, or gaming have been on the increase. So it's about thinking about where is the audience. So conversely, audio and video is going up. So as, marketers with brands and if we're responsible for advertising budgets, we need to really think about where are our people engaging with content. And if audio is one of them, then how are we going to include that? There's my voice. How are we going to include that? Before I jump into how we include it, I want to give you a few considerations to think about. And one of them is the Serial effect. How many of you have listened to Serial, the podcast Serial? Yeah, it's a pretty big number. It's not as big as people who have listened to podcasts though, but if you haven't, I recommend it. It is good. But it was released in 2014 and it really changed the game for podcasts, because podcasts have been around since 2004. There's some disputes associated with Steve Jobs and who created them, but I don't know. So 2004, they've been around. And in 2014, Serial came out. And podcast numbers had been slowly increasing, but it was very slow. And then suddenly this podcast came and it had 40 million downloads by the end of the year. This is massive. It was the first ever podcast to reach 5 million downloads. As of 2018, it was 340 million downloads over season 1 and season 2. And the thing that Serial did, it really changed the game for podcasts because it's a narrative style podcast that is told over around 8 episodes, but it's one story that goes through the episodes. And it continues the narrative, but it brings in different characters. It has suspense, so you get to the end of the episode and they leave you with some sort of hanger. It's like a Neighbours or Home and Away or something. You know, are they going to get married or is she going to go off the cliff or whatever? But this, you know, so they've really built it. I mean, and the producers, it's highly produced. Serial is beautiful to listen to. It's audio gold. And the budget, it's got a budget that's produced that. So it's really good. The same producers also created S-Town, which is one of the most beautifully produced podcasts I've listened to. I don't like the story, personally. I don't know if you've listened to S-Town. I won't spoil it for you, but I have a philosophical objection to part of the story. But anyway, it's beautiful to listen to. So this impact means that bigger players are now getting involved. So you've got ESPN and Apple Podcasts have just announced that they're going to start creating content. The BBC, you know, these companies are spending big money producing this audio gold. And I hear a lot of marketers saying, well, you know, we can't compete with that. How can, you know, we can't be on that same level. But my thinking is it's a complete opposite because as all these beautiful produced content comes in, more and more people are listening, more and more people are discovering. 400 million, 340 million people are downloading and listening to this content because of the higher end versions that are coming in. Realistically, the smaller players aren't going to have that same impact. We're not going to be able to draw in the same. But if we're in the pool and we're swimming with them, then we're more likely to have those opportunity to be exposed to these markets. And they're making the market bigger for us, which is a good thing, me being a small player. So I'm happy with these people coming in. And also it just shows no signs of slowing. So what's going to happen? I've alluded to this. Yes, so there's more players coming on board and it's getting bigger. How do we compete? Because marketers will do what marketers do. This is what we do. We make noise. I am a marketer and I understand this. And some of the noise isn't great, but it's our responsibility to try and make some of the noise less annoying. You know, platforms like Anchor are making it easier to create podcast content. People can do it from home. I've been on this journey for nearly 4 years creating a podcast and started with no podcast knowledge myself and a video guy who was, you know, willing to give it a go. But over those years, we've learned and we're self-taught. We did some online courses. So it's possible. It's easy, you know, for you to... Easy, that's not true, but you can learn and do this yourselves. So it's, you know, as the popularity with audience increases and it's more accessible, then more people are going to do it. But what I want to say and one thing to take away is that it's the same as all content. So long as we're creating good, valuable content, we're telling stories, we're relating to our audience, we're considering our audience's needs, then the noise doesn't have to be an annoying noise. It can be noise. It's all noise, but noise that people want to listen to, that they want to find, that's going to help them in their journey in life or buying decisions or whatever it is that you do. So it's, you know, yes, we're going to make it noisy, and you know, marketers do sometimes. Like, you look at Facebook now, and it's covered with ads and things like that. The user experience is not so great. Hopefully, we won't do that to podcasts. So I implore you, let's, you know, get on board and make podcast content, but let's make it great. So another thing for this consideration, so I'm just trying to set the scene about where this podcasting fits and how it relates to you, and if you're not already doing it, where do you relate it to you? If you have a large library of videos already, then you already have an audio library because video has audio. Just ask Chris. And you can repurpose that content. It is a way of getting involved, thinking about starting podcasting by reusing current content that you already have. I would put a note there that audio content from a video doesn't necessarily translate directly to podcast because a video has the visual component. So you do need to understand that when you're using audio for a podcast, you're relying purely on the senses the sense of hearing and listening. So they're not seeing anything, and chances are they're doing something else. So you can't rely on the visual picture to tell those words. The audio has to. So that's just something to be mindful of. But saying that, you can then use your audio content from your videos and potentially repurpose it. And I know as marketers who are trying to manage budgets that the ability to repurpose content is really important. It also works in the other way. Once you've got established podcasts, you can create video versions and audio versions, and then you transcribe it and you've got blog versions. So it creates a really good, rich depth of content for your mix. And I know from personal experience that it's always that chasing the content. We release Be The Drop every Monday. And so our saying is like, let's not be chasing Mondays, because every Monday comes around without fail and we need to release. And we have done for nearly 4 years. Okay, considerations to make a podcast. I just wanted to put a little summary slide in here, and then I'm going to move into a case study example that I think has done this really well. Now, to me, apart from frequency, length, and release, this applies to all marketing, to any piece of content, and I don't think podcasts should be considered differently. Sometimes we get caught up in the technology or how we're going to distribute that, or the fact that it's recorded, so it's slightly different. But realistically, and people have been talking about this, who is your audience? You need to know them. And we just heard from Nick and Elliot at HubSpot, you need to know what the goal is. And so a number of podcasts there's a huge percentage of podcasts that have what's called in the industry pod fade, and they might start and get to about 6 episodes and then just sort of taper off, because there wasn't a goal, there wasn't this planning done. So it's not about just going out and having a podcast because everybody's got a podcast. It's about being specific. Who are you going to talk to? Why? And what type of content will they value? So is that going to be is it an interview style podcast, or is it an informational style podcast? Is it a panel? It really depends on the goal and then the value that your audience will get from it. Then you start getting down into how frequently will you release it? Is it a daily podcast? Do you have capacity to do a daily podcast? Is it weekly, fortnightly? If you're stretching it out to monthly, I would recommend that you're going too far as frequency. And then you might need to look at a release, and a release might be seasonal. So if the pressure of regularly creating content every week is going to be too much for you to manage, and you understand this from your planning, then look at season and do a season 1 and a season 2, and set up your audience expectations from the very beginning. This is season 1 and we're going to cover, and in season 2, and you might give yourself 2 or 3 months off in between. That's going to be much more manageable if you haven't got a full production team around you. But so that's getting into specific podcasting and looking at your title, description, and artwork. There are parameters around that. I'm not going to go into those sorts of details in today's podcast. If you want, I talk podcasts. If you want to ask me questions about podcasts, come back and ask me later. Perhaps when my voice is better. Okay, so the example that I want to use today is a podcast called Shameless. So this is about the rise of Shameless, which, how cool is that to say? I was just at home going, and so now I'm going to talk about the rise of Shameless. It's fun. You can say it all sorts of different ways. Okay, so those 2 girls, the smiley girls that were there before, Michelle Andrews and Zara McDonald. So in early 2017, they were working at Mamamia, and they're both writers there, and hosted a podcast called Batch Chat. Now, I'm sure, seeing as so many of you are regular podcast listeners, that you're aware that Mamamia has a large library of podcasts. They're a large library of really popular podcasts too, predominantly female-focused content. That's their gamut. So Batch Chat was, I think rundowns of The Bachelor. I didn't listen. I don't watch The Bachelor, and I didn't listen to that podcast. But they had success and a really good chemistry. They were then really keen to do more podcasts, so they pitched some ideas to Mamamia. And in 2017, July, they pitched this idea for Shameless. And there are two things that they had there as goals, what they really thought, why they thought they should do it. is that they really wanted to firstly tailor for content for young females in a way that they thought that the mainstream media was missing. So there was a niche there that they identified. And they wanted to do it in a way, so they wanted to intelligently explore celebrity influence and pop culture. So Shameless, their tagline is, for smart people who like dumb stuff. So, yeah, and they're really fun. They've got great chemistry. And they want to talk about the dresses that the chicks wore to the awards nights. And I mean, you just look at the hits on those things. People watch that, but they might not want to, go, oh yeah, because maybe it's not, they feel like they shouldn't be excited about fashion or something. I don't know. But anyway, so I really like how they've shaped it in that way that it's, smart people who like dumb stuff. Couple of things there on the blue. This is why I think this is a really good case study. So they were experienced content creators and they had previous podcast experience. So they have come from the world of Mamma Mia, which is really good at creating click sort of style content, draws people in, but it gets regular readership and listeners. So they understand that space and their experience in creating podcast. They knew their audience, and they are their audience as well. I mean, it's not like you have to always be, but they are very authentic and relatable to that audience. And they identified a gap in the market, and they also realised that the content that they could create would be regular. They had a regular source of content. Popular cultural celebrity gossip happens daily, so they knew that they would have regular content that got interest. Then they pitched this pitch to Mamma Mia. It was rejected, but so they launched independently. They got permission. So they're still working at Mamma Mia in March 2018, and they got permission to do it as a side hustle. So just as they're 24, 25, 25-year-old girls, they decide to start a podcast, which they did in March 2018. It took about 10 weeks for this friction to start because they got popular. And they were working for Mamma Mia, who creates these podcasts for women, and had a really popular podcast that was their own on the side. So it caused friction, and I don't know the details, but they decided to leave. So they left Mamma Mia, and they're now doing it on their own. So they're running their podcast. They've got increasing advertising revenue and growing audience. In December 2018, they were on the Best Podcast of the Year list. They've got, so March 2019, 40,000 weekly downloads for their episodes, and that's for each episode, but then up to 100,000 because they have these, they have little add-in ones, and then also when you count in historical backgrounds of people downloading previous episodes, it pushes up to 1,000 weekly downloads. And then the thing that then's happened is they're now getting gigs hosting. They do live shows, which their first one sold out in 10 minutes, and they recently just hosted at Meccaland. I don't know much about Meccaland, but anyway, they did that, and it was a really big gig. It's a big deal. I can't explain why. Okay. Sorry, I'm not the demographic. Okay, but so they quickly attracted their numbers. They got advertisers, industry recognition. But the thing that I think is really good about this case study is that it translates to sales revenue. So if we're in business and marketers, we're trying to drive growth, sales. I mean, I love storytelling and I tell stories, but at the end of the day, what is the purpose for those stories if we're doing it for business? So this translated into sales. Okay, so how can you include it into your marketing mix? Where does it fit? So this is a really big topic, so I've tried to cherry pick out the things that I think are most relevant to you. I have missed huge amounts because I can't cover it all. But if there's bits that I've missed and you want to ask, we can, and if we don't get to cover it today, my email address will be somewhere. Okay, so if you have a podcast, a really important thing is to then connect it to your website. So because that then drives your SEO, connects the content back to you, provides another portal for people to access that content. You can share these links across onto social media as well. So again, it's about driving people. I mean, in my experience, it's always about driving people to your owned content into your website where you can. So it's, most WordPress templates, or depending on, what the back end of your website is, it's not hard to add a podcast page to your website. And also, it becomes automated. So once you set up this template, you then use an RSS code in the back of your website, and every time that your podcast publishes through the host, wherever you've got your podcast hosted, it will then automatically add that episode to this page. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not going into technical stuff. But basically, every week when my podcast comes up, it automatically appears on my podcast page on the website. This is actually my blog page for the which includes podcast episodes as well. So I publish my podcast on 2 places on my website. I have the automated RSS under podcast, but I also do a bit of a blog which has got more details in it as well. So this is around the way that you can advertise within podcasts. So if you're looking at potential revenue options, because obviously creating podcast content costs money. So as marketers, we're looking at ways that we might be able to either advertise ourselves, so our own businesses or brands, or whether we can create, link into revenue streams that have a good fit that can be promoted. So for example, here we have a relationship with Soundstripe. And so in the podcast itself, I mentioned Soundstripe. There's a code that listeners can use, and then it gets embedded around on the pages on the podcast as well, and linked in the show notes, which I'll show you show notes in a minute. Here. So this is one of the things that I get asked a lot by marketers. How do we actually track conversions? Because the podcast audio is floating out there in the audio land. So show notes is currently one of the best ways of doing that. So literally, if you open a podcast, they have show notes listed underneath. These are all live links. So once people have clicked on there, you can track that through, and then it connects into your Google Analytics. So then you know exactly where people are coming from. That does require people to actually click. They can do it directly from their phone, and most people now are listening to podcasts from their phone. So show notes is a really important way for marketers to link in to getting conversions, to tracking ROI from podcasts. Another way, if you're looking at how to share podcast content, because we've talked about the fact that you can share podcast content through the podcast directories, but then you can also share it across your social media channels. I talked about podcast hosts. I use Libsyn. Libsyn were one of the first podcast hosts that came into the market. Their interface kind of looks a bit like it. But, their interface is kind of old school. They've been around since, I think it was 2008 or something. They've been around for a while. But I really like using them. I find them very user-friendly. We've tried with other platforms, and this one is my recommendation. It's not free. There are a few free options around, but it's not super expensive. I think I pay $15 a month for hosting. But anyway, so you come in here and you get various codes. So we use the permalink code there. We've copied that, put it over here onto Facebook as a new post, and it brings up, so in the back of this, I've uploaded an image for that article, I've uploaded the description of that article and the title. So that all comes across with that link, and you can post that on various different social media platforms. So it is a way of sharing and connecting your content. Ryan, can you make that play? I'm not the best with technology. So this is an audiogram which you've probably seen versions of.
It's a true co-creation. The artists, the venues, the fringe team, the fringe staff, the audiences, the people of Adelaide. Every single person is so critical in the ingredients of making this magical festival work. To transform a city for the entire month like that, to sell nearly 1 million tickets a year. This has grown organically over the decades. Every single person who's gone before in the fringe has contributed to why we are now experiencing this magical success.
So earlier this year, we had the really exciting job of creating a podcast for Adelaide Fringe, which was like very cool. I mean, it was pretty intense because Fringe is intense, but a lot of fun. But one of the things that was really successful for Fringe was sharing these audiogram style grabs on social media. They got a lot of traction and a lot of clicks from their social media back to the podcast versions from this audiogram. Like we did photos as well, but these were more popular. So you can share, this was the most popular version of getting people to engage with this post and then also then engage across onto the podcast. So basically it's just an audio clip from the podcast, a short clip from the podcast. You put it into audiogram. Again, there's a small cost associated with audiogram, but I don't know what it is, but it's not high. And then it does the captioning automatically for you, so which is great. Check it. I mean, it's an AI version of captioning, but it's pretty good. I mean, we think it's better than the YouTube version. So it's fine, but still check it. And then you can stylize it. And you can create a template, which is what we did for Fringe. So their template had the 2 icons and the logo at the top, and then just a space for video and their colouring in there. So you can create a template and then just update that as you go. Pretty user-friendly. There is another one that we probably like better called Headliner. So if you want to look at that, but it's not as user-friendly. So I say we, I use the royal we, Chris, because Chris actually does this. Chris has a video editing background, so Headliner is fine for him, but if you're coming without editing background, audiogram is easier. So, I mean, whichever, they're both good. Okay, this is a really important note, and if you are thinking of creating a podcast, if there's one thing that you go away understanding, I really want you to understand this. And you might already understand it, but honestly, this is the number one question that I get, or the number one problem that we see, is that people don't truly understand the distribution of podcasts. Podcasts are not like Facebook, and you post onto Facebook, and then everyone is going to see it. Podcast comes from a host, so, and it creates the RSS. So in the middle, the yellow, your RSS feed. And that gets pushed out to all these different, and again, that's only some of them. Like at the moment, we connect to over 30 podcast directories. So you need to make sure that you are connected to all of them. And just because you have a podcast and you launch it, doesn't mean it gets to these. So, and actually it won't, unless you do some things. So this is where I see people fall down. They've got a podcast, they're putting it out there. They might have connected to Apple, or they might have connected to Apple and Spotify. But then they're not necessarily in all these others. Some, there is a disclaimer, some of the others automatically feed from Apple because they've connected to Apple for you, but not all of them. And the problem is with all of these 30 different directories is how they connect is all different. And you have to manually go through and fill that in. You only have to do it once. But if you don't do it, then your podcast won't go there. The little lightning bolt doesn't exist until you've connected it. Once it's connected, then every single time you publish a podcast, it will update via your RSS. So you do only have to do it once. But that needs to be understood. And if you're talking to anyone about podcasts, they need to make sure that that's understood. Do that once. And honestly, every time we connect and new directories come up, so it's about staying up to date with the directories, and every time we connect, we see an increase in numbers, in download numbers, which is obvious because different people access from different points. So it's just that because it's not the same as the way that we have previously distributed content. If you publish it on your website, it's on the web. That's not how it exists with this. You hit publish, but if you haven't connected these channels, then it won't go. Okay, I feel like I got that point. I really wanted you to know it. I get asked about it a lot. Okay, so before diving in, because number 3 is super exciting, create your own podcast. It is very cool. For someone who loves talking, it's good. But normally when my voice is better. But there are other ways to think about it. You might not want to, particularly in business, you want to try these things. And that was the thing that was mentioned earlier, test it. So some ways are to be a podcast guest or get your CEO to be a podcast guest. Get some highly influential people within your business to get onto podcasts that are relevant to your audience. It's not just any podcast. Find out who's podcasting in your industry or in a niche that you want to be known as somebody who's relevant in that industry or niche, and get on that podcast. A little bit of advice there. I get lots of people now who ask to come as guests on my podcast. And it's very clear to me when it's just a copy-paste and they're sending out this email to lots of different people, hey, I've got lots of great things to say. You should have me on your podcast. I'd delete them. I'm not interested. There are people that then contact me and say, hey, I have listened to this. I know about you. They'll give me something about me and my podcast so they understand. This is what I can offer your listeners. So if you're pitching to be on a podcast, make sure you understand their audience. Because remember, if we come back to it, the successful podcasts are the ones that connect with their audience, that provide value. So pitch yourself or your CEO or your business in a way that can provide value to that podcast's audience. It's really important. And they'll get you on. Like some of the best, I've had really great emails like that, and I can offer this and this and this, and I'm all like, when can I get you on? Let's do it tomorrow. Okay, so then other things is, and I talked earlier at the beginning, the advertising revenue that's being spent on podcasts is going up and up. But it is still quite an affordable way to advertise. I mean, if you're going to go some of the massive podcasts, yes, you're going to have to be competing with bigger dollars. But if you're in a niche space and maybe you're in gardening or you're in trades or something like that, there's a podcast on pretty much everything. If you've got a niche audience, and so it's a smaller audience, but they're a qualified audience, you can potentially advertise with those podcasters for really affordable ways, and you're getting to your target audience, and they've done all the work. So definitely look at spending some of your marketing budget. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just start, a way to make sure that you're not missing out on this audio content where people are listening. Extend your reach and get into that by advertising on podcasts. Find someone that's already talking to your target audience and reach out to them. And then, or if you really think that you've gone through all of this, then create your own podcast. It is a really great way to build connections. I would say, I've been working in podcasting. I've been working in marketing. I finished my degree here at UniSA in 2000. That's a while ago. Before Facebook existed. So I've seen a lot of the changes, and I've been around and across a number of these different things. And for me, podcasting is one of the most exciting. I get people who send me emails and they really genuinely listen to the content, like 20 minutes of content. And they've got extra questions about things. They'll go from listening to my podcast to get onto Instagram and talk, tell me about something and try and connect with guests that way. It crosses over people's platforms, and it really, particularly some content, it really connects with them and they will reach out. I get emails from around the world. We've trended in Turkey, I don't know why, and the Philippines, etc. So, I don't have international audiences with my blogs, but through podcasting, it is a way that I can connect on a bigger scale. So it's something to consider. I wanted to give you 2 top tips as well, 2 top resources. And also, so podnews.net is an incredible, now James Cridland, we're videoing this, so I'm just going to throw this in as a weird little aside. for James because he's offering, like if somebody recommends Pod News and gets 5 people to sign up, they get a free like a coaster, like literally just a coaster, right? So can 5 people here sign up? James, I've just, Pod News. Great. Sorry. I create a lot of content and I will cut that into a video and I'll send it to him. I'm in marketing, right? Surely this is the audience that can relate, yeah? Okay, and so Pod News. He goes through, this is a daily news thing. If you're looking at podcasting, considering podcasting, if you want to argue podcasting within your business, sign up because regardless of the coaster, he goes around and curates. So James, I think, was originally from Adelaide, but he's now in Melbourne. He curates all of the top podcast news. So it's just a curated newsletter of articles, but it's all of the top ones, and it gives you a bit of an explanation about what's in it or why it's relevant. So I just read that bit and then go, I want that or that. Often gives you the latest stats and data. So it's really useful if you're trying to understand what's happening in podcasts or potentially get other people to. So definitely podnews.net. And Chartable is only relevant if you have a podcast. So, or if you're going to have one. Chartable, what it does, some of the analytics around podcasting are slightly challenging. The different platforms like Libsyn, for example, Omni is an Australian version, do have good analytics and they will give you some good data. But the problem is all those different directories that I mentioned. Your podcast is being sent out to lots of different directories and they don't all necessarily talk. So there is a little bit of challenges around podcast analytics. Chartable provides an aggregate of some of that data and will give you better insights. So if you have a podcast, you should sign up because you can get some extra data that way. Okay, oh my gosh, I'm coming to the end. So are you podcast inspired? I'm just channeling some John Lee Dumas there. Did I? Where are the Americans? Oh, yeah. Are you inspired? I even did that with my voice. That's amazing. Okay, I am going to be launching a book from podcast zero to podcast hero, but it's actually going to be a book that walks you through some of the steps to launch your own podcast. We're going to have some supporting video resources. I'm writing this book now and I love it that I'm promoting it before I've finished writing it. I'm a marketer. But so there's a link there. So narrativemarketing.com.au, Podcast Hero. I'm looking for 5 people who want to test the course for free. So joining up and doing the book, you have to sign up. Go on that form. You have to fill in a form, a dreaded form. Don't put in dodgy details because you won't get in the course. So literally it will be rough and raw for those 5 people because I really want people to tell me what they don't like, what works, what does. But if you prefer, because that's going to be just an ebook with some videos, if you prefer in person, you've loved listening from me and you want to hear more from me, oh my gosh, I'm not on Tinder. Anyway, sorry. Scout Digital, where's Erica? I do training with the wonderful Erica at Scout Digital Training. I run a full-day podcasting masterclass. It's pretty intense. It's a full day. And she's got expression of interest at the moment going for that. So check that out too. I think I got through it. Wow, okay, that's all from me. They're the dates. Any questions? And I'm sorry, I just couldn't cover everything.
But then what will Lena do?
So my question was, do you have a recommendation for a good length for a podcast? And is it good practice to record a long podcast and then cut it into series?
Hey. So that's like probably the number one question. How long should a podcast be? And I was literally talking to Ryan about this earlier. There is industry data around 20 minutes is a good length. However, really, in all things, if it's good content, that's how long the podcast should be. I mean, I listen to Mike Rowe. He's got a podcast for people with short attention spans, and it's about 5 or 7 minutes. I quite like that one. But then, as I said to Ryan, and I mentioned the Joe Rogan show. I don't know why I mentioned it because I actually don't like it. But he has done episodes that are like 3.5 hours, and they have millions of downloads. So there isn't really a right or wrong answer about how long to be, other than so long as it's good content. Would you listen to it? And if you shared it with other people, would they listen to it? So editing is really important, editing it down. And then the final bit of your question was, should you record one really long and then cut it down? I suppose that really depends on the topic. And yeah, I don't know. I think that comes back to your strategy, thinking about your plan, what is your goal, and what are your audience going to get out of it? Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. I don't have 3.5 hours ever in a row. So I don't listen to really long podcasts, like probably 40 minutes. So Serial is about 50 minutes, each of those episodes. And I binged those. So then, yeah, it depends. I'm not sure that I really answered your question. How about you go?
Just as the person who's asking the questions and leading the podcast, in terms of your planning, do you say yours are usually about 20 minutes? Yeah, pretty all told. And obviously you edit them, so who knows how long they might actually be when they're done raw. But do you kind of have to try and keep things on track is what I'm sort of saying. Do you go, I'm probably going to go in, I want to get X, Y, and Z out of this from the research that you've probably done on the person that you're talking to, but do you allow yourself that ability to see where the conversation goes?
Yes.
And how do you kind of keep things on track, or is that the beauty of editing?
No, look, I try to keep things on track because Chris tells me off. But sometimes you get in the conversation and it's really hard, because you want to maintain flow of conversation. And if you're continually stopping someone from talking, they're going to lose their confidence in their train of thought. So you have to allow conversation arc, but still try and guide it. Yes, I have a plan. I do send some indications of questions. I'm a bit reluctant to do this, but a number of people feel uncomfortable without it. But I tell them I don't stick to questions. This is an indication of what I want to ask you about, because generally they say stuff and the conversation flows and you're like, well, that's gold. I mean, I will also know, I always have key points that I want to get out. And sometimes I may ask the same question 3 different ways, because some people are harder to answer to it. But I've already prepared an idea of what I want to try and get out from the research on that person. So I'll re-ask it a few times. But yes, so preparation is really important, and trying to manage the conversation without stopping conversation. That's yes. And active listening. That it's a real skill, and it's something that I have, dedicatedly focused on trying to improve, and feel that I have, but I've had to practice. Because you're listening to them, you're thinking about your questions, thinking about what they're answering, evolving what you're going to ask them next. You have to be in that moment. Interviewing requires you to be really, really present. Any other questions?
Hi, first off, that was very interesting, thank you. Did you have any professional speaking experience prior, or would you recommend people take courses in speaking before they start one?
Yes, I have. I trained through high school, actually. I studied effective communication as like an extracurricular activity because I was super cool, obviously. But I love talking, and so my dad was like, well, you need to do something. So I studied, and then I actually went on to teach that. So yes, I have had a lot of speaking practice. I don't think you necessarily need to do that level of training, but doing some courses. Toastmasters is a great way of getting involved and speaking. It is a skill. I think just because everyone can talk doesn't mean we can necessarily all publicly speak or, to have interviewing skills. They're things that you need to particularly practice on. So yes, I would definitely recommend looking. I think WEA does courses as well for public speaking, but I would recommend that, yes.
Okay, last question over here then.
Hi, Amelia. Thanks for the insightful presentation. I was scrolling through your podcast. Two questions. Do you have any favorite episodes that I could listen to first, just to get a bit of a taste?
You want me to give you, it's like, what's your favourite child?
And
but
the
you
second
can answer
question,
that.
which you kind of touched on before, was how do you monetize podcasts? Is it like a numbers game, ad space, that kind of thing, or is there something I'm not catching here?
Yeah, okay. So how do I monetize, or how does people generally monetize? Okay, so my strategy when I started my podcast was not about monetization. It was about learning this new medium that I saw had a real space in marketing and how we were telling stories. And for me, so it's an extension of my business. And I now get work. So we provide podcast production. We assist people to create podcasts. We edit podcasts, and I mean, we got involved with Adelaide Fringe. Like, I had Adelaide Fringe as a client. That's unreal for me. I'm a small business. It's myself and Chris part-time. We have a few other part-time consultants that we work with. So really, for me, it's about business awareness and brand awareness. We are doing some affiliate links now. So the Soundstripe thing is an affiliate link. Listeners get a discount code, and then if they subscribe using our code, we get a percentage back. So affiliate links is a big way for podcasts, but brand advertising revenue is really increasing. So at the beginning, there's there's an ad roll, like you can have a space at the beginning of your podcast where it's like 15 seconds or 30 seconds. And if you've got a host, the host will potentially read it, or it could be a pre-recorded ad. So it's pretty much like radio advertising. There's a lot in the podcasting industry that's crossed over from radio because they're both audio. So yeah, you can have paid advertising spots. You can have a mid-roll, but they're not as popular anymore. People don't love the mid-roll, but still, plenty of podcasts still do, and an end-roll ad. So you've got spaces in the podcast where you can advertise, and then some of the other links, so the call to action, so you can have advertisers can place their links in your show notes. So if you talk about them, so it's a bit of internal product placement, and then you can link to their website, so they can do that as well. It's becoming more sophisticated because as the dollars that people are spending on advertising in podcasts, there are now becoming more providers to help you. So you can have dynamic ads in podcasts now as well. So that means, because podcasts are an ongoing evergreen content. So they're always there. So, you're looking through my catalogue of podcasts, and there's hundreds of, nearly 150 of them. So there's lots, and they will be there forever. What can happen now is somebody can place an ad in, but, that's the original podcast was 3 years ago. They've changed their ad, so that ad space is now dynamic, and they can put in a new ad and change it over. So there's this ongoing rolling revenue opportunity. So it's becoming more and more easy to add revenue from podcasts because they're becoming more popular, and that will just continue.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Amelia.
Hi.
Now,
Thank you.
token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
For maybe when you're feeling a bit better. So subtle sponsor plug / segue. Our sponsor, Scout Social, who's not paying any attention whatsoever, so that's awesome time for a plug. We're talking about you, Erica. Scout have a really good South Australian podcast that you can jump on and subscribe to. And you also are one of those people that use audio